So this is a little bit of bait and switch, not for the usual reason, which is that the abstract doesn't correspond to the paper. The abstract does correspond to the paper, but I've been listening to the other presentations, and it seems to me that understandings of Vygotsky and even some understandings of Halliday have become gradually more and more social behaviorist. And so I want to draw some lessons from what happened to Vygotsky's work for you, how Vygotsky was transformed into a kind of a social behaviorist as a kind of a warning for what might happen to us in systemic functional linguistics. This is the paper I wrote. This is the paper I was going to present. I was actually going to upload it to the chat, but I see I don't have the power to upload things to the chat. And I was going to upload a series of articles that I wrote on this very same data, because I'm one of these people who, for whom data is, recyclable. I keep going back to the same data like a dog to its own vomit, and lapping it up again and regurgitating it again. And I've got 3 articles on this that I would like to share with you, because I think there are some interesting points. But we must distinguish between what is essential and what is merely important. And so I want to talk mostly about scaffolding. It's a metaphor. It's a bad metaphor. And it is something that Vygotsky himself hardly ever used. I've read almost everything. I've read everything Vygotsky published, and an enormous amount that he didn't publish, including his notebooks. And I've only found 2 places where he even mentioned scaffolding. One is a building scaffold, and he's talking about Berlin, and there are building scaffolds all over the place. And there's an oligophrenic young child who is finding it very hard to find his way home because the landmarks he uses to navigate are covered with scaffolding. And the other one, a little bit closer to the kind of scaffolding we know, is he and Luria are talking about how children learn to walk. And they don't learn to walk with help from a more knowledgeable other, which is the usual definition of scaffolding. It turns out that the child they're looking at, which I think is one of Luria's kids, sorry, it's one of Vygotsky's own kids. Luria didn't have kids at that time, is using 2 chairs as a kind of scaffold to stand up. And those are the only places where Vygotsky talks about scaffolding, which is significant because scaffolding was a big metaphor at the time. Russia was a sort of revolutionary constructivist place. Scaffolding was a huge motif in artwork. And Vygotsky doesn't mention it, doesn't like it, doesn't consider it a good thing to talk about. So I want to talk about where scaffolding really did come from. And then if I have time, I'll present the paper, which is, contrary to what the reviewers who rejected it said, it's not unrelated to this discussion of scaffolding. But let me start with this man, with Brunner, because Brunner really starts with scaffolding. Scaffolding really starts with Brunner. It doesn't start with Vygotsky. And Brunner begins his account of the inspiration of Vygotsky in sort of typically American, autobiographical, anecdotal, egocentric mode, a mode I will try to avoid, talking about a conference he attended 30 years earlier in Montreal, where he met the Soviets for the first time. And he hears about Pavlov, and Pavlov has something called the second signal system. And he knows what the first signal system is. That's the dog drool system. That's a stimulus response. And so he's interested in the second signal system. And the second signal system turns out to be language. It turns out to be linguistics. It turns out to be language folded back on itself. It turns out to be culture. It turns out to be everything that we study in systemic functional linguistics. But Pavlov's account of it, and particularly what Pavlov's epigones make of it, is, well, kind of nutty. And I think the word that, the charitable word that Brunner himself uses is gaga. Pavlov divides the human race into 2 types. There's the intellectual Jewish type, which is dominated by the second signal system, by culture and by art and by language and by linguistics. And then there's this first signal system where everybody's sort of animalistic and responding to images, which is for the other people. Brunner adds here that this system is a kind of scaffolding, that what Luria and Leontiev and the post-Vygotskians, the people who were Vygotsky's immediate students, are trying to do is scaffold the real understanding that Vygotsky had of what Vygotsky was calling a systemic and semantic approach to consciousness. Now, this was not possible under extant conditions because when Vygotsky died, he was denounced as an idealist for his focus on language. And Vygotsky's ideas were and still are, to an important degree, retranslated into the language of behavior, retranslated into the language of activity. And they are still today, even in the form adopted by particularly Jim Martin and the friends at Sydney University, what's called activity theory, which is a very strong emphasis on non-language activity, on tools rather than science, which is kind of paradoxical when you think about it. Here is Vygotsky, who died trying to develop a systemic and semantic theory of consciousness, and somehow the Vygotsky that we use in systemic functional linguistics is neither semantic nor systemic. and I should say that by semantic and systemic, Vygotsky means exactly what we mean. By semantic, he means thinking. That is to say, all of the systems that lie between context and lexicogrammar, as David defined semantics yesterday. And by systemic, he means metafunctions, because he's talking about functions by which he means things like attention, he means things like memory, he means things like thinking. But these systems are, and perception, these systems are organized, and these functions are organized into higher systems. And these higher systems are dominated by language, and by what language lets us see, what language lets us attend to, what language lets us remember. And so I suggest to you that, in fact, what Vygotsky is really working on, he's working towards a semantic and systemic understanding of consciousness, identical to the one that we are working for in systemics. Okay, so Brunner meets up with the second signal system. He finds it gaga, and he notes that the second signal system is a kind of scaffold. It's a way of introducing very behaviorist psychologists to some non-behaviorist, cognitivist, as he sees it, ideas. But Brunner himself is an ex-behaviorist. And I'm thinking of an early work of Brunner's where he actually says that intelligence is the distance between stimulus and response. And so Brunner's own uptake of Vygotsky's concepts, which are, remember, are based on a still narrower reading of Vygotsky's actual texts, were not very likely to catch the true meaning and the true import of the systemic and semantic theory of consciousness that he was developing on. In fact, Brunner's work focuses on two data sources. The first is evidence from inside the laboratory. And I'm thinking in particular of Brunner, Woods, and Ross, where he's studying how children construct a model pyramid out of wooden blocks. And the researcher does what the child can't do, then does along with the child what the child could not do alone, and then finally lets the child do the whole task by herself or by himself. And that's very similar, of course, to our teaching learning cycle. But there's also evidence from outside the laboratory. Brunner studies book reading. I've been reading with great pleasure the book by Painter and Jim Martin and Len Unsworth on reading visual narratives. This is one reason why I was so interested in Salsan's presentation. And the example that Brunner gives is of a mother reading this book, Dr. Seuss's One Fish, Two Fish, Red Fish, Blue Fish. And so they're going through and mommy says something like, "Oh, look, Richard," and then introduces a query, "What's that?" And of course, the child doesn't say anything. So the mother says, "It's a fishy." And then at the end, "Yes, that's right," where the mother's taking on both roles. And then gradually Richard starts to say something that could be, "That's right," after this very crude bit of discourse analysis is done, and then gradually moves up to its efficacy and eventually is asking his own questions, his or her own questions. Now, in both cases, both inside the laboratory with the wooden pyramid and outside the laboratory with one fish, two fish, the goal of scaffolding is essentially that of the TLC, the teaching learning cycle. It's a process of learning that takes minutes and moments, maybe months, not years, not decades. And yet, I submit to you that the zone of proximal development, which Vygotsky does use a lot in precisely the last 2 years, when Vygotsky is developing his semantic and systemic theory of consciousness, the zone of proximal development is exactly what it says on the label. It's a zone. It's the area between two age levels, two age periods, defined in years. It's proximal. It means the next thing that the child is able to do. If you do a task with a child and the child then can do it by himself immediately, you have just proved it's not a task in the ZPD because it's part of the child's actual development and not the proximal, the next zone of development. It's a zone. It's the space between age levels. It's proximal. It means the next zone of development. And in French, it's translated as zone prochaine de développement, meaning the next in line. And also, and this is the most important part, it's development, not learning. The ZPD is not about learning. It's not a pedagogical tool at all. It's actually a diagnostic, like a thermometer, for measuring the distance to the next zone of mental development. I'm giving you as evidence, not a text that's hard to find. This is by far the most widely quoted bit of Vygotsky that he ever wrote. And it's also, as a result, as a direct result, it's the most widely misunderstood bit of Vygotsky. And I want you to notice a couple of things about it. The first thing is, it's kind of vague. He's very offhand about the assistance. He says, the first step in a solution, a leading question, that's some other form of help. And he actually elsewhere, he says, different methods will be used by different experimenters, not teachers, but experimenters. That's the first thing, that it's kind of offhand about the systems of aid. The other thing that is not mentioned here are the tasks. We're not given the tasks. He assumes your familiarity with the Binet tests, the Binet-Simon tests, which were IQ tests of his time. These were tests that at the time were not used to measure something called IQ. They were actually used to place difficult children in difficult child classes. And since Vygotsky was very interested in what he called defectology, what we would call special education, or disability studies or whatever, he was very interested in the Binet tests. The Americans took over the Binet test and they said, oh, it's an IQ test. It's for telling the difference between the sheeps and the goats and the blacks and the whites and so on and so forth. That all came later from Godard. The tests that Vygotsky is talking about here are the Binet tests. But Vygotsky also says, we don't know what these tests are testing. We don't know how they're testing it. And there isn't any particular reason to think that what they're testing is actually mental development. So the tasks are missing. The tasks that we should use when we're measuring the ZPD are actually missing. Something else. The age levels are missing. The actual developmental milestones are missing. So where do we find them? Well, the answer, I believe, is right here. It's systemic functional linguistics. The top one is not systemic functional linguistics. It's a kind of a hybrid that I produced from reading the late works of Vygotsky and trying to synthesize them with Halliday's own studies of the ontogenetic development of the child's powers of conversation. And so it's a hybrid synthesis. The bottom one you will all recognize as being Halliday's system network for the development of mood, actually, in the English language. Now, the reason I put it up there is that I believe that the answer to all of our questions, the question of no tasks, the questions of no developmental milestone, and the question of no age levels, actually lies exactly where Vygotsky thought it was, in language, and that we can trace development by using a system network. In other words, treating the system network not as a scaffold, but as a kind of a winding path upwards, or you can think of it as a set of intersections. So we all know, anybody who drives a car knows that, at least in my culture, not in Australia, this is the other way around in Australia, right-hand turns are easier than left-hand turns. Left-hand turns, you've got oncoming traffic, and so on. Now, I wanted you to suggest that the child is going into making a clause and has a choice between right-hand turns, which lead to minor clauses without a predicator, and left-hand turns, which lead to major clauses. You all know this. This is the thing that we're looking at. Major clauses, which have a predicator. Okay, then the child has a further choice. That is to say, it can be indicative or imperative. And once again, I'm going to suggest that the right-hand turn, at least for a 3-year-old, is going to be more likely than the left-hand turn. Certainly in Korea, because Korea does not, kids are actually late in learning nouns. They're very big on verbs. Okay, so then on the left-hand side, once again, you get the distinction between interrogatives and declaratives, and then you can break that down further. My point here is that we should be able, at least, to see development as a process of differentiation. The more the child develops along the horizontal axis, the more options the child will have. And possibly even set up the different options in terms of probability at a particular age. And by doing this, we can provide the tasks, and they could be any task. They could be any task in which language is central, although I'm going to argue there are certain tasks that have a critical, even a revolutionary function in child development. We can provide developmental milestones, milestones then being sort of particular forms of grammar, of wording. And then finally, we can correlate these with ages. And so in order to do this, I want to, because I said, I don't think anything will do. I think that we want particular tasks. And the task I chose was, how do parents warn their children about sexual predators? Every Korean parent has to have the conversation, where the conversation is not between Black parents and their kids about cops. That's what it is in America. It's between parents and their children about sexual predators. It's a serious problem. Kids are taught to be friendly and to be helpful to particularly older strangers, but they also have to worry about sexual predation, particularly here in Seoul, which is a megacity. Okay, so this is from our elementary school book, and I hope you can tell from my tone of voice the difference in these situations, although they're presented as being the same. The kids are supposed to write refusals, polite refusals in each case. So the first one is, 학생이 짐이 무거웠어. 그런데 조금만 가면 우리 집에 있거든. 좀 돌아다 줄 수 있겠니? And that means something like, give me a hand, I'm just going right nearby. But the second one is, hey, 학생, 강아지 좋아해? 우리 집에 아주 예쁜 강아지가 없는데, 있는데 좀 아프거든. 집에 부모님 오실 때까지만 우리 집에 가서 같이 강아지 주시 않을래? Now you can see these two situations are very, 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 very different. I'm not saying that the gender of the child is particularly relevant, but the gender of the potential molester is relevant, and yet they're presented as the same. So that gives us an interesting question. How does mommy, who's an elementary school teacher, teach the two kids, 7 years old and 10 years old, that these two situations are actually quite different, significantly different? And in order to try to get some sense out of the data, I did sort of what Susanna's just done, which is to set up a way of classifying and describing my data. I wish I had read Kimira Sensei means Korean grammar, the one she's publishing with Cambridge University Press before I did this, but I didn't. It's based on Son's grammar. And I wanted two things. I wanted to see, first of all, what are the differences between 7 and 10 in what the child says? And secondly, what is the gap between what mommy says to 7 and what mommy says to 10? Because that will answer the question of whether parents really do scaffold their children or not. And I think it's 11:05. And Allison, I'm going to have to conclude very soon, right? If I want any discussion. Is that right, Allison?
Yes, it's Cassie
Okay,
and Maria, but you have, we will conclude at 12:15, including Q&A. So
yippee. Okay, so that means I do get to talk a little bit about the data. I want to say that the gap existed. First of all, there was a huge gap between 7 and 10. 7 did take a lot of right-hand turns, lots of elliptical language, lots of depending on mommy, lots of not being able to uptake what mommy said because it was at a grammatically very difficult level. And that brings me to the second problem. What is the gap between what mommy says to 7 and what mommy says to 10? And is it different or is it the same size gap? In other words, do parents scaffold? Do they scaffold their children? Well, the gap between mommy's language and that of her children was very different. So in her sentences, mommy uses explicit themes, which are marked with nun, nearly twice as often as 7. 40% of those themes are not participants. 9 out of 10 of the 7s are participants. So 7 is going for people as her themes, and mommy isn't. Mommy is using topical themes, and that's partly because she's constantly responding. 10's use of themes was indistinguishable from mommy's. There was a slight difference in their use of non-participant implicit textual themes, but I'm not sure the implicit textual theme category is going to stand up after I read Kimira Satsumi's book. So theme is used very often to change the topic of conversation, and 10 is very interested in that because 10 wants to control the conversation. Other differences? Well, the gap between the children and the ideal form of language was statistically significant in various ways. But they're not generally modal assessment. They're not generally do this, do that, don't do this, don't do that. They are already by age 7, very adult-like in the way they're exploring that vast territory between yes and no. The vanguard, the cutting edge of their development is really elsewhere. And this to me suggests that the work of Tor and Chiu and Claire Painter, of course, but also Halliday and Hassan on ontogenetic development is spot on. It's the interpersonal gateway. It's the interpersonal function has developed by the time the kid is 7. Ideationally, mommy uses a lot more explicit processes, a lot fewer minor processes with her 7-year-old, and uses fewer existential clauses and more dynamic clauses with the 7-year-old. That's weird. Shouldn't be that way, but it is that way. In her textual choices, as we've seen, it's a lot more sophisticated at 10 than it is. Right, 2 minutes remaining. Cut to the chase. Everybody, the database I used wasn't small. It was 1,200 clauses, but it was a single conversation. But the kids are very individual, and I did ignore things like gender, not an ignorable factor. And I ignored birth order too. It matters very much that the boy came first. Vygotsky would say I turned what was a problem into a postulate. But we have taken the postulate of scaffolding, which is taken for granted, and turned it once again into a problem, the problem of establishing the zone of proximal development. If I have time for one last crack, Vygotsky drew his immediate data from the classroom, either via students or through his own work with difficult children. Brunner used laboratory experiments and also tried to imitate home environments. But when we take the long view, it should really be the other way around, because Vygotsky, as a cultural historical psychologist, he didn't invent the ZPD, he discovered it. And he discovered it in the way in which 7 and 10 are related. 10 is the ZPD for 7. 10 is 7's future. And Brunner, on the other hand, is really doing experiments. So I think that studies that explore child-parent talk in just this way are very much part of our SFL tradition. Just read Halliday and Painter and Tor Oldenburg and Cho, and of course, Hassan, a Macquarie professor. But for us in cultural historical psychology, these studies are our next zone of development. And Allison, that's all I had. Questions?